Leviathan-Afterword. This is a word from Scott Westerfield himself, the author of Leviathan, and these are his thoughts on the book that he wrote. Leviathan is a novel of alternate history, so most of its characters, creatures, and mechanisms are my own inventions, but the book's timeline is based on the actual summer of 1914, when Europe found itself lurching toward the disastrous war. So here's a quick review of what's true and what's fictional in the story so far. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his wife Sophie Chotek were assassinated by young Serbian revolutionaries. In my world, they survived a first pair of attacks, but were poisoned later that evening. In the real world, however, they were killed in the afternoon. I wanted my book to start at night, just as the Leviathan, the assassinations led to war between Austria and Serbia, which spread to Germany and Russia, and so on. By the first week of August, the globe was embroiled in the Great War, now called World War I. Those tragic deaths and some appalling diplomacy among the great powers of Europe resulted in millions more. There were rumors at the time that the Austrian government, or perhaps that of Germany, had secretly arranged the murders, whether either as an excuse to start the war or because Franz Ferdinand was too peace-minded. Few historians believed this conspiracy theory now, but it took decades to be disproved. Certainly the German military was determined to get a war started and used the assassination to do exactly that. Franz and Sophie had no son called Alexander, though. Their children were named Sophie, Maximilian, and Ernst. But just like Alec in my story, these three were forbidden to inherit Franz's land or titles, all thanks to their mother's less than royal blood. And just as in Leviathan, the parents had implored both the Austrian-Hungary emperor and the Pope himself to change the situation. In the real world, though, Franz and Sophie did not prevail. The romantic story that Alec tells about the tennis game and the pocket watch is entirely true. Charles Darwin really did exist, of course, and in the mid-1800s made the discoveries that are at the core of modern biology. In the world of the Leviathan, he also managed to discover DNA and learn to reach into these life threads to create new species. In our world, the role of DNA in evolution wasn't fully understood until the 1950s, however. We are only now fabricating new life forms, and none so grand as Darren Sharp's airship home. Nora Darren Barlow was also a real person, a scientist in her own right. The Columbine Nora Barlow flower is named after her, and she also edited many definitive editions of her grandfather's work, but she was neither a zookeeper nor a diplomat. The Tasmanian tiger is an entirely real beast. You could have seen a thylacine much like Taza at the London Zoo in 1914, but no longer, despite having been the top predator of the Australian continent. Only a few thousand years ago, the species was hunted to extinction by humans in the early 20th century. The last known Tasmanian tiger died in captivity in 1936. As for the clanker's invention, they are somewhat ahead of their time. The first real armored fighting machines didn't enter battle until 1916. They couldn't walk, but used tractor threads just as tanks do today. The world's militaries are only now beginning to develop useful vehicles with legs instead of threads or wheels. Animals are still much better at walking over rough terrain than any machine. So, Leviathan is as much about possible futures as alternate pasts. It looks ahead to when machines will look like living creatures, and living creatures can be fabricated like machines. And yet the setting also recalls an earlier time in which the world was divided into aristocrats and commoners, and women in most countries couldn't join the armed forces or even vote. That's the nature of steampunk, blending future and past. The conflict between Winston Churchill and the Ottomans over seized weapons is also based on fact, but that is best left to the second book, which follows the Leviathan to the ancient city of Constantinople, capital of the Ottoman Empire. I hope you enjoyed the book as much as I did.